This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone and welcome to World to Win. Of course, before we start, make sure that you're subscribed to our channel and also that you're subscribed to us on all podcast platforms as well, because we're putting our episodes on there as well. And as you can tell, today we're trying something a little bit different. I've got Darragh here with me. We're actually neighbors now.
Yeah.
So we wanted to try and see how we can do World to Win a bit differently today. So how are you doing, Darragh?
I'm not bad. Good to be in the new place.
Yeah.
I dodged the bullet in helping you get some of your furniture set up. But nice to finally be here in the new studio.
Yeah, there's now going to be the World to Win studio. And I'm also going to apologise in advance if you can hear my cat, who is munching on all the cardboard boxes. So that's another thing that's happening. But what are we going to talk about today, Darragh?
Well, today we're going to be talking about historic elections that happened there a number of weeks ago, particularly in Northern Ireland, and what these reflect in terms of both historic crisis of capitalism, some general trends in society, the flaring up of the national question, the potential for sectarian division. We're also going to put this in the context of broader struggles that are taking place as well, and the potential for more workers' unity and significant struggles to take place as well. So to discuss this, we're going to be joined by two very special guests from Northern Ireland. We have, first of all, Chris Stewart, who's a trade unionist with Unite Hospitality and also a member of the Socialist Party in Northern Ireland. How are you doing, Chris? How are you? What have you been up to in the recent period?
Yeah, I'm grand. How are you doing, Darragh? Just recovering really from our election campaign, obviously, which we're going to be discussing here a bit. But yeah, just enjoying the rest after what was a pretty grueling campaign, you know.
Brilliant, good stuff. And then we're going to be talking to Amy Ferguson, a guest we've had on the show before. Amy was proudly one of our candidates in Northern Ireland, who ran a really excellent campaign that we will be delving into in further detail, but is also a trade unionist doing trailblazing work with Unite Hospitality. So how are you doing, Amy? How are you? What have you been up to in the recent period?
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, I've been good. Similar to Chris, working away, but also kind of recovering from the elections, and also actually starting to meet up with a lot of people who heard about us during the election campaign who want to get involved. So that's pretty exciting as well.
Great to hear. So let's dive straight into it then. These elections, of course, we'd often say they're not the be-all and end-all, but I think election results do, and the dynamic of the campaign can give us a snapshot into society, the different moods, the different trends. So what would you say were some of the dominant issues of this, and what were some of the key takeaways from the results of these elections?
Yeah, well, in reality, this election kind of marks a new stage in the crisis of the so-called peace process in Northern Ireland, which began in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement that brought an end to the Troubles. And while, that agreement brought an end to the daily violence of the Troubles, in reality, it didn't solve any of the divisions within society here. In fact, it merely institutionalized those divisions. For example, there's more so-called peace walls, which are walls that literally divide unionist and nationalist communities today than there ever were during the Troubles. As well as that 71% of people in society want there to be integrated education, but only 7% of students go to integrated schools, and schooling and education is still deeply segregated here. And the overarching process of the decades since the Good Friday Agreement has been toward a digging in of sectarian division and the growth of the more hardline parties of unionism and nationalism, the DUP and Sinn Féin, respectively. And this election was mostly fought as a battle between those two parties to see who got the First Minister position, which goes to the largest party. Interestingly, kind of despite being in government for nearly a quarter of a century and consistently implementing attacks on working class people, Sinn Féin's main slogan during the campaign was "Vote for a real change," which is kind of ironic. And near the end of the campaign, to vote for a First Minister for everyone. But really, it wasn't their campaigning that led to what ended up being a electoral success for Sinn Féin. It was actually the approach of the DUP, which was seen as intransigent amongst many Catholics that kind of gave Sinn Féin its victory. Because before this election, the DUP faced significant opposition within the Unionist community due to their previous support for the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is part of the UK's Brexit withdrawal agreement, which basically implements customs checks on some goods travelling between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And sort of anger at the protocol emerged within the Unionist community. It was seen as creating a border in the Irish Sea, cutting Northern Ireland off from the rest of the UK. So the DUP kind of faced opposition from a small but more hardline loyalist party called the TUV, the Traditional Unionist Voice, on this issue, and they sort of scrambled to take an anti-protocol position. So before the election, they collapsed the government, and in the lead up to it, and said that they wouldn't enter government until this protocol was scrapped. And in the election, the DUP lost, I think, about 6.7% of its vote. But actually, before it was projected to do much worse than that, so that actually represents something of a recovery from the polling before the election. And primarily, they lost votes to that TUV party, which received 65,000 votes in the election, including challenging for some seats. And this has been sort of an important pressure on the DUP, and really the sort of this pressure will only kind of intensify going forward. If anything, the crisis facing this peace process as well will only intensify. Sort of key loyalist figures in the Orange Order have said that unionism has a mandate not to join the executive and to sort of ensure that the government cannot function. The DUP have said they won't elect a speaker or a deputy first minister until the protocol is dealt with. Meaning none of the political institutions can function now. But of course, it wasn't just the sectarian dynamic that dominated in this election. The cost of living crisis that is facing all working class people was also a significant issue throughout the election, and it was clear that none of the political parties provide any solution. There's a lot of disillusionment, I think, from working class people about the ability of the political parties to actually solve this crisis. And so while the results of the election do not immediately reflect it, there is real frustration amongst working class people at the main parties that is really felt in society, and we definitely saw that throughout our campaigning work. And it's telling in a sense that all of the parties kind of had to shift at a certain point their communication strategy throughout the election to talk more about the cost of living, because it really reflects the pressure and the anger that is bubbling up amongst working class people on this issue.
Yeah, and I think, one of the main things that was so kind of obvious and glaring about this election is that for the first time in the 101 years of Northern Ireland being like a thing, we saw Sinn Féin getting the majority of the seats, which is kind of unheard of. Obviously, Sinn Féin is a nationalist party, which means it's on the Republican side, on the Catholic side of the national divide. And that has never happened before. And in fact, there was a BBC commentator that actually said, which is very unusual for the BBC to admit anything like that, that Northern Ireland as a state was literally designed to prevent this from happening. So I was wondering if you guys can explain to us what is the design? What was Northern Ireland designed to prevent from doing, and why that was the case?
Yes, so the northern state came into existence about just over 100 years ago now, by the partitioning of the island in 1921. Now, partition wasn't an inevitable thing. It wasn't like an inevitable reflection of, community divides or even disputes within the Republican within Republican politics, but actually it constituted quite a conscious effort on behalf of the British ruling class to counteract a really big and growing radical labour movement, which was uniting Catholic and Protestant working class people in struggles for their shared interests. So At one point, for instance, in 1919, there was like over 100,000 workers engaged in the engineering strike. During that strike, for about 4 weeks, the working class were in control of Belfast, the city. That includes they controlled who got electricity, who didn't. They include the printing presses. Just in the years before that, in 1906, there was tens of thousands of young women workers out on strike for a pay rise. That was spontaneous action. In 1907, again, there was over 100,000 workers on the street, both Catholic and Protestant. In a struggle for pay rises, and that dispute itself also led to police mutiny at one point. So that was the context of partition. You know, there was a really revolutionary movement in Ireland, actually north and south, and British imperialism really feared that its rule was going to be challenged. And beyond that, if its rule was challenged in Ireland, which was one of its strongholds, that would have, you know, really detrimental impact for it across its empire. You know, at one point there was communication between the British state and the unionist establishment, like the unionist politicians, who even said that actually the biggest problem, the biggest threat facing the union right now was Bolshevism, it was socialism, because, you know, the majority of working class people, especially a lot of working class Protestants, were actually turning away from the unionist and nationalist parties and looking towards Labour, looking towards the trade unions. So in that context, the British imperialism acted to divide that union movement, trade union movement, and to divide by dividing the island in two, it created two sectarian states, one in the south that was dominated by the Catholic Church, and one in the north, which was ultimately set up as like a Protestant state for Protestant people, and which in the context of, you know, deep poverty for working class people in general, it particularly discriminated against ordinary Catholics in terms of jobs and housing prospects. And it ultimately wanted a unionist state with a minority Catholic population so it could continue this policy of divide and rule, so it could obscure these class interests that working class people were coming together on. And obviously since then, we've had the civil rights struggle, we've had the Troubles, the peace process, but a unionist party had always remained the largest party in the assembly until this election. And you know, Chris pointed to some of the reasons that Sinn Féin were able to win this position, including the splintering of unionism, and as well there's been an underlying process of demographic changes in the north, where whilst Protestants used to make up a huge majority, this is actually rapidly in decline. But it should be noted as well, and like whilst it is important that we recognise that this is a historic change, whilst the DUP isn't the largest party in Stormont, unionism is actually still the largest designation in the assembly still. And yeah, we also have to say that, like, again, whilst it's historic, this election isn't actually going to resolve anything. Even if the DUP return to the executive, it's still going to be more of the same pro-capitalist sectarian parties running the show. And again, as opposed to resolving things, we're actually seeing that deeper crisis at the heart of the peace process, where the contradictions that were placed within the Good Friday Agreement are coming to the fore and challenging the stability of the capitalist institutions and of bourgeois democracy in the north as a whole too.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jamie. You mentioned in the past the interests of British imperialism, how it cut across this developing revolutionary movement in Ireland quite consciously as the age-old tactic of divide and conquer. And I think if you look across the world today, the various sectarian conflicts, ethnic division, and I think a lot of it can be traced back to the crimes of British imperialism. But British imperialism is in a very different state today than it was back then. And I think if you look at not just what's happened in Northern Ireland, but also several crises that are involved, constitutional crisis, undermining the basic integrity of capitalism's oldest state. We have the prospect of a second referendum on independence in Scotland, which support for independence, you know, consistently over 50%. But also, I think one time during COVID last year, we had support for Welsh independence at an all-time high of 30%. So in that context, what do you think the response of British imperialism will be to these elections? How have they reacted? And what are some of the broader geopolitical implications that this result will have?
Yeah, I think definitely this is a significant political crisis for the Tories and the British ruling class more generally. And in a sense, the Tory government is kind of caught between competing pressures here, you know. First of all, it's important to note that the Tory government and the Tory party more generally seem to be split on this issue, which I think reflects the crisis of British capitalism more generally. The Tories have responded to the constitutional crisis in the north of Ireland by agreeing to unilaterally change the Northern Ireland protocol, which I mentioned before. Boris Johnson has repeated that every unionist that was elected in this election stood kind of unambiguously on an anti-protocol position, and their move against the protocol really reflects the pressure that they feel in this regard. And whereas in the past, the more recent past, Northern Ireland has not had the same strategic importance for British imperialism that it would have had in the 20th century. As you mentioned, the context of growing aspirations for Scottish independence and now even Welsh independence as well now threatens a kind of a broader breakup of the UK. So in this context, anything that can destabilise things in Northern Ireland, including a move towards a border poll, will likely be resisted by the British government. But on the other hand, there's a section of the Tories, apparently including Rishi Sunak, who were opposed to the unilateral changing of the protocol, which is going ahead now. And this is because this really threatens to create a new confrontation with the European Union, the Irish government and US imperialism as well. And as has already been indicated by the EU, this could result in the emergence of a trade war between the UK and the European Union. And in the context of a broader economic crisis of capitalism and a slide back into global recession, this could really have far-reaching implications in that sense. And it also comes at a time when all the forces of Western imperialism have been trying to present a sort of united front in the face of the war in Ukraine. And this really could threaten to undermine that in a sense as well. So the fallout of this election is likely to continue for some time, and it's not immediately clear how things will unfold. And I think it's also worth mentioning that all of these forces, whether it's the Stormont parties, the Irish government, the British government, the EU, or the US, they're intervening in Northern Ireland in the interests of the capitalists that they represent, not in the interests of working class people in the north of Ireland. And as such, they have the potential to really further inflame sectarian tensions at certain points. For example, even just the other day, a US congressman, Richard Neal, in attempting to sort of diplomatically intervene on the question of the protocol and so on, referred to the unionist population here as planters, which has sparked absolute outrage. So that's just one example of the sort of ham-fisted approach of these different imperialist forces that can really inflame tensions here.
Yeah, and I think like when we talk about this, and obviously talking about the collapse and crumbling down of British imperialism is always a fun thing to talk about. But I think it's also like what you said is really important, that we can't forget that it's not just British imperialism that is the problem. Of course, it's a huge problem, but it's not like the Irish government is less capitalist, or under an Irish government, even Catholics in Northern Ireland will have a better situation. So yeah, like it's really important that we kind of clarify that it's not like the Irish government is, the solution to all of the problems. We're talking about crises that beyond just Britain, and are impacting everyone around the world really because of the system that we live in, because of capitalism. But then I think that we have these big winners of this election, Sinn Féin, which I think, I don't know, obviously, you're coming from Ireland, I'm sure you have a lot of opinions about Sinn Féin.
I mean, it is incredible just how, talking to people from the US or elsewhere, how that image of them being like quite a radical left party or even a socialist party. Yeah, I know you were in Ireland, in Dublin for elections there, where there's a bit of a Sinn Féin surge, and I don't know the impression you got when you were talking to ordinary people and their impressions of them. Yeah,
it was kind of incredible to see, because I think, coming from another place that has a big national question, it's kind of like a sentiment that is very recognizable. I think that kind of the representatives of the oppressed are considered to be very much on the left, even if it's not necessarily the case, and I think maybe in Israel-Palestine it's much more glaring that some of the parties representing the oppressed are not actually on the left and are not actually in the working in the interests of, you know, the working class people of either community, really. Which I think is also always a complicated question, right? Because we always do want to stand behind the oppressed. But the question is, how do you actually stand behind the oppressed? And I'm not sure what you guys think about Sinn Féin. And do you think that Sinn Féin is like this party of the left that's like radical force on the left that's supporting the working class? Or is it, you know, a party that is maybe gain that impression on the international left, but isn't necessarily what it is?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like with the surge of Sinn Féin in the south in this election, I've seen a lot, like on social media and beyond, of a lot of international leftists sort of celebrating Sinn Féin and celebrating this as a victory. And I suppose it's particularly jarring for us, as you know, people who've had to actually live through the consequences of Sinn Féin's time in government in the north. But I can see, you know, probably why from afar they would seem particularly appealing to young leftists. I mean, in the south, they've made moves in recent years to sort of pose themselves as a left opposition to the government parties. They talk about or pay lip service to the question of the housing crisis and building public homes, and the question of tackling the cost of living crisis and stuff. But unfortunately, as I said, like, their track record in the north actually paints a very different picture. I mean, first of all, Sinn Féin are a sectarian party. They base themselves essentially exclusively on one side of the community in Northern Ireland. And actually, a few years ago in North Belfast, they were even so brazen in doing so that they printed leaflets essentially implying that the demographic makeup of the area was one that basically they were saying, like, basically if all Catholics were on their best behaviour and voted Sinn Féin, they could get an MP. Like, they were that brazenly sectarian, you know. And it's just one example of them frequently and consistently relying on these divisive narratives during the elections. And it's both Sinn Féin and the DUP who are actually reliant on whipping up these narratives, especially during election time, to obscure those class interests and protect their voter base. Yet, outside of election time, it's Sinn Féin are actually united with the likes of the DUP and Alliance in actually implementing the likes of Tory welfare reform in the north, which has had devastating impacts on working class communities, and it's left those, you know, most vulnerable on the poverty line, and it's left the welfare services, you know, pretty unfit for purpose. At council levels as well, they've been involved in voting to sell public land to private developers. They've enacted cuts on local community services like youth groups, like hospitals, and even actually Irish language facilities too. And they've been championing beyond that as well. They've been championing for a long time the lowering of corporation tax, obviously at a time when multinational profits have never been higher. They argue for an all-Ireland 12.5% tax, which is actually even lower than corporation tax in the UK. And Ireland, as it stands, is already a tax haven for huge companies. And I think it was telling that Owen O'Brien, who is one of the most prominent figures in Sinn Féin in the south and is associated with the progressive side of Sinn Féin in terms of their programme on housing, he even said himself that multinationals have, quote, nothing to fear from a government led by his party. And you know, that's shocking. Like, multinationals should be shaking in their boots right now, right? Whilst the working class movement rebuilds itself, that's the side that so-called pro-left part or so-called socialist or left parties should be assisting right now. They shouldn't be telling multinationals not to worry. They should be telling multinationals, here, you should be worrying, you know. And whilst they as well celebrate, one thing Sinn Féin hold over the DUP is that they are, you know, more progressive on social issues like marriage equality, like abortion rights. But it should be remembered actually that they were also dragged kicking and screaming to those positions by movements of ordinary working class people. And even then, their position actually on abortion rights is actually pretty shaky. So even last year, when the DUP put forward a bill in the Northern Irish Assembly to restrict abortion access, down to cases of fatal impairment, Sinn Féin actually abstained on that bill, which allowed it to pass. And this is actually pretty unsurprising, considering that's essentially the stance of their party. And actually, in the local by-election where my Sinn Féin MP was elected, she even openly said that Sinn Féin only supported abortion rights in very limited circumstances. So they're saying it themselves. So yeah, essentially on a lot of questions, there's an absolute gulf between how Sinn Féin present themselves and their actual actions when they are in positions of power.
Yeah, and as well as that, this election also saw like a significant growth for the Alliance Party, which is like a liberal party that doesn't designate as Unionist or Nationalist and sort of poses itself as being a cross-community party. They more than doubled their seats in this election. This was most pronounced in kind of Protestant middle-class areas, which are pro-union, but also voted against Brexit. But the vote did increase across the board as well. And I think there's a small section, maybe mostly of young people, who may look to Alliance as sort of an alternative, to the orange and green parties. But in reality, Alliance are perhaps the most nakedly neoliberal party, and they have consistently supported austerity, cutting corporation tax, as well as things like regressive water charges that would harm working class people. And even on international issues, I mean, recently the representatives were very openly supporting the idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine as well. Their political platform generally is one of poverty for workers and free reign for capitalists to profiteer. And on this basis, the divisions within our society will never be solved, So while there may be some young people who maybe just see them as a viable alternative in some sense, I don't think it really reflects deeper illusions in their ideas or their record,
Thanks, Chris. Just to go back to Sinn Féin now coming out as the largest party, that also means that there's been a lot of talk on, the march, a seemingly straightforward now march to Irish unification. And I think you also have the trend in the south of Ireland with Sinn Féin in the last election in 2020, had a bit of a surge, and also actually their biggest mistake was not running enough candidates after not doing as well as they thought they'd do in 2019. And now, with that in mind, there's the possibility now the next election they could come out as the largest party in the south. So those two trends now has people talking about a border poll, which would be basically a referendum on Irish unity and United Ireland. And there's basically thought that this is a straightforward march in the next 5 years. Now, earlier we spoke a little bit about Scotland. There in 2014, we had a referendum on independence, which actually what was driving that was this working class discontent that wanted to not only break from Westminster, but actually was driven by this desire for a new type of society, free from austerity, inequality, etc. And in that case, we put forward the idea, we supported independence, not tail-ending the SNP, not supporting a capitalist independence, not having any illusions that could really solve the problems of working class people in Scotland, but putting forward the idea of an independent socialist Scotland as part of a socialist federation of England, Wales and Ireland. That was quite a radical campaign, a huge kind of step forward in working class people being radicalised, talking about politics, but also like quite amount of unity as well. A lot of people some might think a border poll might have a similar dynamic, but I want to ask, do you think that's the case, and what would that look like in practice?
Yeah, as you said already, we've seen Sinn Féin kind of argue that preparations need to be put in place to move towards a border poll, arguing that a debate needs to be had on the question of Irish unity. And really, this is no surprise. I mean, Irish unity via a border poll is in essence the reason for Sinn Féin's existence and their success in the recent election here, and then also their recent electoral successes in the south will be used to push that question. But really, this is just the development of a process that's been happening for a while now. As Amy mentioned before, the demographic shifts in the north have meant that there's a sense broadly in society, especially amongst Catholics, that we're moving towards a border poll and that it's inevitable. But it's not quite as clear cut as much of the international media have presented it. I.e., that the way they've presented it is that this election means a border poll is imminent. For a start, the Good Friday Agreement means that only the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, which is part of the British government, can actually call a border poll, and that would only happen if some kind of non-defined conditions are met. And I think, as we said, in the context of the threat of the breakup of the UK, the British government is unlikely to allow this to go ahead. And Brandon Lewis, who is the current Secretary of State, has kind of categorically ruled out a border poll in the immediate period. It's likely, I think, that Sinn Féin will attempt to pressure the British government into making kind of clear what those conditions for a border poll are as part of these preparations, and also pressure the government in the Republic of Ireland to push the question, which has already sort of begun. While the main parties of Irish capitalism, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, kind of claim that they are Republicans, the question of Irish unity has always been posed by them in a very abstract way. We can see that begin to change, and I think, but in general they will be very cautious about a border poll. The Irish capitalist class, in reality, does not have much interest in unifying Ireland on a capitalist basis, partly due to the economic weakness of Irish capitalism, but also due to the fears of a backlash of unionists in the north. Leo Varadkar recently said in the Dáil that there's actually less support in Stormont for a border poll in the next 5 years after this election, due to the sort of gains made by Alliance, who wouldn't support that. And I think that kind of reflects that the political establishment in the south remains very cautious about the issue of a border poll. And I think, while many people from a Catholic background see a border poll as a way of meeting their national aspirations, we have to be very clear, I think, about what a border poll in the north would actually look like. The lead up to such a referendum would lead to significant significant rise in sectarian tensions, and any vote would in reality end up being a 50% +1, either for or against, and it would just be split right down the middle in terms of community divide. And this really does not offer a real lasting democratic solution, and would likely only lead to further division and even the potential for conflict. I think a narrow vote in favour of the Union would still amount to coercion of nationalists into a state they don't want to be a part of, while a narrow vote of a capitalist united Ireland would mean coercion of unionists into a state that they don't want to be a part of. And as Marxists, we oppose all forms of coercion, and this also includes the British government refusing to call a border poll, which itself would be a form of coercion that would risk raising sectarian tensions too. I think whether it be the Stormont parties, the government in the south, or the British government, none of these institutions, once again, have the interest of working class people in mind, and as such, none of them have any real solutions to the divisions in society. They only kind of represent the interests of their own national capitalist classes and landlords. Because capitalism is a system based on poverty, exploitation, and division, really cannot solve the national question in Ireland and heal the divisions within our society. I think in the past, as Amy kind of mentioned earlier, there have been important examples of working class people across the sectarian divide coming together through the trade union movement, for example, to fight in their own interests on a class basis. And those examples can really break down sectarian division, because a united struggle of working class people against this exploitative capitalist system really is the only force that can actually challenge sectarianism.
Yeah, I think, what you're saying here connects really well, I think, to another element of these elections, which you talked a little bit about before, about alliance as well. But I think generally what was really clear in these elections was that it wasn't just the sectarian issues, which obviously we don't want to minimize. And the issue of a border poll as well can be a real kind of trigger for even more sectarianism. But at the same time, we saw these elections really focused on the cost of living issue, which I think, hit in Northern Ireland a lot. And I think around the world, everyone who was watching it can relate to how terrible this issue is. And I think that also connects to another kind of trend that we're seeing in Northern Ireland of this kind of unionization kind of surge, a lot of strikes, a lot of industrial action we've been seeing in the last few months. So I was wondering, first of all, if you can tell us a little bit about that element of the elections, but not just the elections, just also what kind of strikes have we seen, what kind of unionizations have we seen, and also whether you think this is going to continue even after these elections.
Yeah, absolutely. The cost of living the crisis is putting massive pressure on working class people. A recent poll before the election showed that a third of people here would be unable to pay an unexpected bill of £300, while close to one in 10 reported that they're skipping meals regularly because the choice for them is between eating or heating. But this is really just the extension of a crisis that has been developing for years for working class people. I mean, Northern Ireland has the lowest discretionary income in the UK, and with the slashing of welfare in recent times and pay cuts specifically in the public sector, but stagnant wages more generally, these have had a really bad impact here. I mean, Northern Ireland has some of the most impoverished areas in all of Europe. But as you say, working class people here are beginning to fight back against these conditions, providing really a powerful warning, I think, to the bosses that working class people just won't take it anymore. And I think we'll see this dynamic develop potentially all over the world. We've seen something of a strike wave in the north with thousands of workers participating in strikes, ballots, or other forms of industrial action in the last few months. Many of these workers were being applauded as essential workers when society was in lockdown. But are now being offered by their bosses real term pay cuts. For example, 11 local authorities, including refuse workers and leisure centre staff, went on strike recently alongside housing executive workers after they rejected what was really a scandalous pay offer of 1.75%, which is obviously a real term pay cut amidst massive inflation, and really has just come after years and years and years of consistent pay cuts. And also in the public sector, public transport workers in TransLink have threatened strike action, saying they would grind services to a halt after they rejected a 3% pay rise. And that strike has been called off now due to negotiations with management, which are ongoing. But it similarly reflects the willingness of workers to take action, and they were able to pressure management to get a better offer, but we'll see how that develops going forward. Health workers as well have overwhelmingly rejected a 3% pay offer, by like 92% of them voting against it, and they're hinting at industrial action later in the year. But even in the private sector, many workplaces have engaged in industrial action. Workers at Caterpillar, for example, have taken strike action to fight for decent pay increases from an employer that is a multinational company that rakes in revenues of billions of pounds by ruthlessly exploiting its workforce around the world. And these workers are now into their 6th week, I think, of strike action, and are likely to continue striking for many weeks to come. Education workers as well been on strike. I mean, see, just recently we saw management at Ulster University here effectively engage in a lockout of workers who were planning a marking boycott as a form of legitimate industrial action to protect their pay and pensions, and to challenge the increasing casualisation of their employment. As well, even gig economy workers, workers for Deliveroo, Just Eat and Uber Eats went on strike in March against low pay and bogus self-employment. It was a great, really energetic picket line. And this was the first strike of its kind in Belfast, the first gig economy strike. And I think it really shows the potential for layers of, quote unquote, unorganised workers to fight back and start to get organised because of the pressure of this crisis. I think what's really significant about a lot of these strikes is that pay offers or conditions that would have been accepted and deemed acceptable in years gone by are now being overwhelmingly rejected, which I think really shows that workers are just hitting the limit of how far they can be squeezed,
Yeah, and I think we have kind of like this very unusual opportunity that sometimes in the show that, we're talking a lot about these opportunities, and also talking a lot about the criticism that we have for the parties of the establishment in this election. But we actually have here on this show a candidate who ran in the election. And to those of you who don't know, Amy ran in the election, as well as Neil Moore, another member of ours in Northern Ireland. And I wanted, because your campaign, Amy, was really focused on these worker struggles and on, creating this cross-community unity as well. And I was wondering, first of all, kind of what was the impact of these points, like when you talk to people on the street, and like how important was it to them and to the campaign as well? But also, what is the difference between what you and Neil put forward and what the other parties put forward in the election?
Yeah, so on the question of supporting the striking workers and pointing to the workers as an important example of what we can do to really change the current cost of living situation, it was incredibly well received. I mean, a lot of people, like on one hand, there was a lot of apathy actually about the elections and about like what would actually be achieved. We've seen a cycle of these elections at this point where there's like big promises the big promises by the main parties who have been in government for literally decades. They'll be like, this time we're really going to do something, I promise, and then they don't. So on one hand, a lot of people were kind of fed up, but then on the other hand, people were saying, but actually look at these people, look at the bus drivers or the local authority workers, at least they're actually fighting for what they want. There was an acknowledgement that actually the government is not going to step in and give a pay rise to anybody, and that it was actually going to take that type of action. So it was inspiring to talk to people. It was inspiring when we're talking about all the time, talking about the need to unify across, unite across, community divisions in our shared class interests. Whilst we're always talking about that, it was really significant to actually say, I mean, look, these guys are actually doing that right now, in the context of a polarized election, in the context of a really difficult living situation for most working class people. These people are cutting across that, so that was a really important part of the election. I think actually it was quite funny. At one point I was out with the picket lines with the local authority workers, and they were marching up to one of the main offices for the local council, and there was Sinn Féin representatives meeting with the Chamber of Commerce across the street who pretended they couldn't see or hear the workers chanting, and I think actually usually you would get tokenistic visits. Picket lines would get tokenistic visits from establishment politicians who haven't done anything to help them, but who want to, a nice picture for the elections. But I think this time, I don't know, politicians must have been seeing that they would very quickly get chased off as well, because there were none of those types of visits. But obviously, on other issues aside from strike, from the specific strike action, raising support for the strikers, we also took a stand. We were also talking about what was actually needed to fight the cost of this cost of living crisis, rather than just speechifying about it and making vague promises about minor pay rises. We said that the very minimum of what was necessary in the media was a £15 per hour minimum wage, as well as above inflation pay rises, which for most workers is a double-digit pay rise. We also we're calling for the nationalisation of the energy companies under public democratic control to actually kick out the profiteers who are fueling this crisis for working class people. I mean, there was an article came out the other week that says energy price hikes are here to stay for another 6 years, and that's absolutely terrifying for the majority of us who are already living on the absolute brink of things. And again, that's a manufactured crisis when you look at the amount of money that these shareholders and these CEOs are actually taking home, whilst our bills are skyrocketing. We're also calling for rent controls as well, and affordable housing. Proper quality affordable housing as well, social housing. The environment was obviously a really big question. In the local area where I'm from, there's a private company that's seeking permission to gold mine in the local area, and one of the ways that they're trying to get permission from the local community to be allowed this gold mine is that they're promising that it'll bring jobs. Now, the amount of permanent jobs that is actually suggested is incredibly low. Some figures are as low as 12 permanent jobs, So in contrast to that, we're arguing that actually, the question of jobs versus healthy environment shouldn't be counterposed. These things are actually can actually become one and the same. So we're rather than trying to support the gold mine, pretend the gold mine was the only source for jobs, we were saying actually it's time to build, create green jobs with living wages, and some of those jobs could have included the likes of reinstating the railways in the northwest and building actually free, frequent, accessible public transport links, which are very non-existent out in northwest and rural Ireland, as well as obviously the construction of like renewable energy infrastructure and stuff like that. Defending the NHS was a big thing, rather than, again, the establishment parties will always at the elections talk about how they need to defend the NHS, and then they get elected and they go back to the assembly and slowly push in outsourcing measures and cuts towards these types of services. And we also a big issues that we wanted to talk about was actually challenging sexism, gender-based violence, and other forms of oppression, especially whilst there's an absolute tirade against LGBTQ rights at the minute, especially trans rights. So we were talking about abortion access, free on the NHS for all who need it, public investment into services for gender-based violence, and again, this question of like adequate social housing to actually deal with people fleeing, dangerous and unsupportive households. And as well, of course, one of the main things we were talking about was the need to challenge sectarianism by building this united working class movement that could fight for all the other things that we were talking about, as well as the likes of integrated secular education. And again, just to go back to my first point, the striking workers obviously provided a really important concrete example of that type of action that we were talking about here, and that type of action that we said that, socialist representatives should use their positions to actually build, and that can do so even in the context of polarized elections.
I think we've covered a lot here and the many contradictory features actually of this election, because on the one hand, we saw the sectarian nature of it and really the processes that are reflected but are also accelerating of a potential towards more sectarian division. But on the other hand, we saw the real potential for unity, for Catholics and Protestants to come together across the sectarian divide and join in a common struggle against their common exploitation and oppression. And I think it's so important that, Amy, you and Neil made those issues, such as Central Part of your campaign and the fact you got a good response, does give a very optimistic perspective of the potential that is there for this type of joint struggle. But with that in mind, I want to ask, what does the Socialist Party in Northern Ireland put forward as a political programme in terms of pointing a way forward to a lasting solution for the national question?
Yeah, so big question to end on. I mean, obviously the first thing we have to acknowledge, and that this is what Chris alluded to in the earlier question about the border poll, is that actually, first of all, capitalism has no solution to this question, regardless of the options that it, like so-called options that it gives working class people, whether it's the current status quo or a different capitalist state to exist under. That's not a solution, and actually it can help inflame sectarian tensions. But in contrast to that, there's actually so much that indicates a really strong possibility of building a movement to challenge sectarian forces and to actually push back the prospect of a future conflict. Because although the likes of the DUP and Sinn Féin do remain electorally dominant, there's still huge cynicism towards these parties because of their sectarian bickering, but also because of the austerity they've implemented, the attacks they've launched on working class people, and the corruption scandals and just how incompetent they are as well. And whilst that's on the one hand, as we said, there's been really important movements of young people across the sectarian divide in the recent past, whether it's in support for marriage equality, which actually saw 20,000 people take to the streets in Belfast, which isn't an insignificant number here, also in support of the question of abortion rights and in opposition to institutional sexism, to racism, to the threat of climate change. And these movements obviously aren't isolated in the north, but they reflect these broader upheavals which have swept the globe. And these movements aren't narrow, they aren't inward looking, but they actually reflect the broader rejection of this system of capitalism that's in its decay, which means the support for the ideas of socialism, albeit in a confused form, are actually on the rise internationally. And that means also they're on the rise here in Northern Ireland. And as well, of course, when we're talking about this, what can bring lasting change, a lasting solution to the question of sectarianism. In the North, we have to take this context of this really significant strike wave that we're witnessing right now, and it's vital to understand that the trade union movement here has huge potential in actually forming the solution to the national question. The trade unions unite, represent over 200,000 workers from all backgrounds in Northern Ireland, in their common interest as working class people, and that movement numerically dwarfs all the sectarian organizations. It's in the workplace where you might meet someone from a different community background to you for the first time because of the nature of separation of our communities. And so it's where you can learn actually that you have more in common with your Catholic or Protestant co-worker than you actually do with the boss of any background. And throughout the history of the North, of the northern state, the trade union movement has been really crucial. It's been a really crucial vehicle through which the working class has actually acted to challenge sectarian forces at really key points in time. For instance, in the early 1990s, there was an initiative that came almost universally from the rank and file trade union activists to actually strike and hold mass demonstrations against sectarian atrocities of both Republican and Loyalist character. And in that, they really powerfully expressed the desire of working class people to end conflict, to end this bloodshed in both communities. And they played a really important role in actually pushing the paramilitaries and the political establishment towards ceasefires and towards this political, settlement. And it can seem actually the question of national identity and its expressions will always, be contentious and impossible to overcome. It can really seem that way, especially if, especially on the basis of capitalism, and especially if you don't set your sights beyond the confines of this system, which is a system that relies on exploitation, oppression, and division. And when you think that system is all there is, it can seem daunting. You can start to think, actually, there probably isn't a future beyond division. But of course, that's entirely not true. And actually, united struggle has time and time again, both in the North and internationally, diminished and removed, divisions amongst working class people, and the same can happen in the future again. So the Socialist Party, the ISA in Ireland, we say that actually a united struggle for a socialist future would have a really transformative effect, and again demonstrate in practice the common interests of working class people from all backgrounds. And it's in that context that actually workers can begin to break down the barriers between their communities and start to work on these solutions to contentious questions. And again, despite the threat of sectarian polarization, the coming period as well will also has created really important opportunities to actually build socialist organizations, to build a unified struggle of working class people. As I said, there's already growing openness to socialist ideas. There's already more people on the streets in taking strike action than the entire time I've been alive. And again, the economic crisis and the decay of capitalism will only deepen this sentiment amongst normal people. But these opportunities have to be seized, otherwise they can just slip by. And unfortunately, socialists and trade unions have let these opportunities slip by in the past, which created the likes of partition, which happened in the 1960s, which unfortunately led to the outbreak of the Troubles. So to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself in the negative, it's really important for Marxists like ourselves to actually forge a strong revolutionary force that can bring those lessons of our past struggles into the struggles of today to help point a way forward. So I just want to finish on a quote by Peter Haddon, who was a Marxist, a theoretician of the ISA in Ireland. So Peter Haddon said, socialism means taking the major industry and all key services into public ownership and running them democratically, with need replacing profit as the motive. It means no privileged elite, only the right of the people themselves to manage their own affairs. It means creating an international brotherhood and sisterhood, a unity based on respect of difference and in which all national and minority rights would be guaranteed. It's the unity of the working class built in the struggle for such a society that will actually solve the national question in Ireland. I think that's a crystal clear picture of what we need.
Excellent. Thanks very much, and a great way to finish, Amy. I do want to actually have one last question, and I think these elections in Northern Ireland have often been referred to, correctly so, as historic. Well, another recent historic event in Northern Ireland history, of course, has been the last season of Derry Girls, and particularly the last episode, which, don't worry, there won't be any spoilers.
Please no, I haven't watched it yet.
Yeah, but no, don't worry about that. But what I do want to ask is, as Marxists in Northern Ireland, politically, yes or no in terms of what Derry Girls put forward?
If we're talking the last 10 minutes of the last season of Derry Girls, just forget about it. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, well, as we said, no spoilers, but yeah, hopefully those fans of Derry Girls will also get a lot out of this episode as well, and putting things in their context. And I think it is going to be extremely helpful to navigate a difficult period ahead, but also have given us all a very good insight in some of these important struggles amongst workers and youth that really are pointing the way forward. So I want to thank Chris and Amy for their excellent analysis and insight into this recent period. So thanks very much.
I'm here in Stockholm in the climate demos for the Stockholm Plus 50, the UN Convention, and I'm here with about 50 members of the International Socialist Alternative from all around the world. We've come to intervene in the climate movement here to protest outside of the conference. Obviously, the UN is celebrating 50 years of climate activity, whatever that means. Climate crisis is still going on. I don't really know what they've done in those 50 years that there is to celebrate, but this is why we're here protesting for the climate. And the shout out of the week this week is going to go out to all of the members of ISA who came to the protest in Stockholm to support our Swedish section, and obviously the Swedish section as well, but also everyone who joined us at the protest and also at the rally. Even if you just watched us live on Zoom, we are sending a huge shout out, and obviously to every climate activist. If you want real system change, we need an alternative, and this alternative has to be socialism. So join ISA. And this is it for this week. So thank you very much, and see you in a couple of weeks.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!